Hi everyone, I'm Julian and I'm with Gordon and we're both from DataSoc and would like to introduce you today to Jake Olivier, who is a professor of statistics with the School of Mathematics and Statistics, as well as Deputy Director of Transport and Road Safety Research at UNSW. Some of his other research interests include road safety and statistical methods for evaluating public health interventions. So with that said, could you just give us a brief overview of your career so far and your education and what led you up to this point? I know it's a bit of a big question, but
Yeah, a lot of sub questions in there. But if I'd start from the beginning, I suppose I was originally for 1 year I was an engineering student, and I realized I like mathematics far more than engineering, and so I switched over to mathematics. And I did pure mathematics as an undergraduate student. I did that, and I did pure mathematics as I guess effectively as a master's student. We don't have, I'm from the US, we don't have honors years in the US system. And so, but I knew kind of early on that I wanted to do what might be considered applications of mathematics. And where I did my PhD, statistics was the primary, or one of the two, what could be considered applications of mathematics. And I did, the other one I think would have been graph theory, I suppose, or let's say combinatorics. And so I decided to do statistics. So I did my PhD in statistics, and then right out of school, I got a position at a medical university working in biostatistics. And I probably spent the first year or so on trying to learn what biostatistics was, because I didn't really have the background for that. So the chair of my department, when I started there, he actually gave me a book on epidemiology and said, this is what you're going to do the rest of your life. So you need to read that. I didn't really understand what epidemiology was when I started. Couldn't say it properly either, probably. But having read it, I mean, at that point I'd had a pretty strong background in pure mathematics and in statistics. And so reading a book on epidemiology from a mathematical perspective is very straightforward, I think, usually. There are some very difficult concepts in epidemiology that are mathematical, but if you have a proper background, I find that it really isn't. However, epi also has its own kind of constructs and kind of things that are very specific to epidemiology that isn't taught in mathematics or statistics or computing or anything else that might be considered analytics. Like, what is the difference between a case control study and a cohort study, and why you shouldn't be doing certain things in either of those studies or types of studies and other things. Like, there are underneath the mathematical arguments, but they're not maybe obvious from a mathematical perspective. And so I found when I was done with my undergraduate degree and I started out working in biostatistics, which I really didn't know a lot about when I started, but was that I had to learn a lot in I would say a short amount of time, but I had to learn a lot of things in a very short amount of time. I say short in like probably 2 or 3 year period. And it kind of what was good in a sense for me, I think, is it prompted me to kind of have this attitude where I was always learning things. I was always trying to do things in a sense better, or try to pick up new skills as I was going along. And I feel like I kind of have to do that even now. Like in the courses I teach, I come from, I started my PhD in 1995, back before R didn't exist. I don't really know an awful about Python, by the way, so I don't want to say anything. I don't make myself sound stupid about Python. But for me, for stats people back then, SAS was kind of the main thing. And you had to connect to SAS remotely because it was on some big mainframe computer in the middle of campus. Back before PCs were, you could do a lot more, you couldn't do as much with PCs back then. So R didn't exist, so I learned how to do things in SAS, and medical stuff, SAS still kind of dominates in most places, I think. But when I came to UNSW in 2008, I had to learn how to use R because I had to teach R. I also had to learn how to use MATLAB because I had to teach MATLAB too. But I still stuck with SAS primarily for the first few years. But then I feel like primarily because of RStudio and Tidyverse stuff and things that are kind of interrelated to that. It kind of prompted me to give R maybe more of a shot, I guess. And I've over the years tried to introduce more and more R stuff into my courses because I kind of do a hybrid kind of SAS R kind of from computing perspective. I probably do R fully if I ever had to pay for SAS. Maybe don't tell SAS people that, but it's it's very expensive to have SAS, and not everyone has it. Right, R is free, obviously, right? Is that doesn't give me an idea about why I do research I do, I suppose, but that's kind of the background for me, education-wise, and kind of at least the beginnings of my career.
Yeah, we can talk more about your research later on, but just to touch a bit on your experience in education at UNSW, we're wondering if you have any specific teaching methodologies or principles as a teacher at school.
I mean, in terms of pedagogy, I feel like when I teach students, I think it's very important that their students are doing stuff while they're trying to learn. And so irrespective of which course I'm teaching, there's a fair bit of computing involved in it because you have to have understanding about, I mean, methods are important. And I do at length talk about the underlying theory that that either motivates or is the foundation of methods, but I feel like there has to be some computing aspect of it. Otherwise, stats doesn't really make a lot of sense to people, I think. And that you can have a bunch of Greek letters and like likelihoods and all kinds of stuff on a board, but none of it really makes sense until even for me, until you actually have some data and you try to do something with it. And so I've always got those kind of things in my courses. I mean, one of the things that I learned early on at UNSW was that if I put everything on the slide, students didn't really pay attention. And so I've tried over the years just eliminating certain things and then doing it in class. Now, doing things virtually has made that very difficult to do. I do have an iPad with a pencil, but I got it and I tried writing on it. My handwriting is just awful, I guess. I'm okay on the chalkboard or the whiteboard, but I'm not very good on the iPad writing stuff. I've tried to just open up a Word file and type stuff out during lectures, and that seems to be okay. But I feel like if I do that too much, it slows everything down. I really can't wait till we go back to teaching face to face, and I'm sure you guys are the same. It'd be great once we do, but I think active learning, I think, is really important in stats.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really important for a lot of things, but I also think it's really important that our stats students work on not toy examples in classes, but like use real data to learn from. Like I can simulate data all day long. It doesn't really reflect the real world, right?
So would you say that some of these computing technologies that have come along over time have made stats education more accessible to more students?
I mean, to a certain extent, yes. I mean, so when I was in the U.S. as an academic, I was the property officer for the department I was in, which meant once a year, someone from the state came and had to lay eyes on all of our pieces of equipment, which is a bit, it's a bit of a strange thing. But like when universities pay for things, there is accountability, right? And you have to have accountants and audits, whatever, and auditors and whatever. One of the curious things about that, so I started in 2003, was that the department I had a calculator, a handheld calculator. It was a handheld. I mean, it was like about this big, and it had tape in it, as in it printed stuff out because it only had like a little blue screen, so it had to print stuff out, and that's how people used to do analysis of variance or linear or basic regression. It was this computer, but you'd have to type it all in to get the data in, right? And now I can only do, I think, I know it can do one-way ANOVA. I don't know if it can do two-way ANOVA. But so every year I had to find that device that no one has ever used in like 2 decades probably, and show it to somebody, the state auditor, to make sure that we still have it, even though it's never used. So that's how things used to be done, like in the 70s. Okay, and personal computing became more popular in the 80s, and it made things a bit more accessible. But in the mid 90s, I'd started my PhD. I was still having to use a PC to telnet, which is before Secure Shell, to connect to a mainframe and do stuff that way, which meant I had to telnet and dump data to the computer and also run code. And like I didn't have internet in my apartment, so I'd send all my typing code on a Word file or some editor. I have no idea if the code worked. Right? So yes, things are definitely more accessible now than there were back when I was a student. I even kind of knew what I was supposed to do, right? This is me time at that point. I'm not trying to learn how to do stuff. It's like I just want to implement stuff, and it was impossible to do. Yeah, so things are far better. Look, I don't really like the arguing. I don't mind saying that. I don't mean to offend anybody, but I hate the arguing. It's not really a GUI in my mind. But it's fantastic that it's free and open source, right? Like it is, that whole just mentality is revolutionary, I think, in statistical computing. And it's propelled people to do lots and lots more instead of everything closed, boxed, and everything, and having to pay, which SaaS is massively expensive. It's not hyperbole. It is massively expensive. You would not have your own license ever because it's that expensive.
Yeah, I think that resonates a lot with me. Someone who has to use Stata a lot for econometrics. So very big. If you don't know what Stata, it's very
I know
very
that.
similar. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So very big contrast from me, who also uses Python with all, as you said, right, lots of open source packages as well in that area. So very big contrast going from Stata to Python and back. So
yeah, I mean, the normal equations for linear models is not, that's been around for a long time, right? It's not that hard to program on your own to do, right? As an example. So it's not always clear to me why things are so expensive as they are. But yeah, I mean, some biostats people do use Stata as well. It's okay, I suppose. I have no idea how to use Stata. But it's like I know how to program in SAS and R and a bit in MATLAB. I used to use Maple a long time ago to do symbolic kind of stuff, and I'm not learning another. I'm not learning. I hate to say, don't quote me on that. Like I would argue that you should always be picking up new skills all the time. But part of me about Stata is like, I'm not doing
that. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, it's just a bit of fatigue, I guess.
Yeah.
Like if it wasn't for either math, so we teach stats to engineering students, and we teach them using MATLAB. If it wasn't for that, I think I'd have enough room in my brain for Stata, or probably Python. Maybe I'd go Python at this point, or Julia, I suppose.
Yeah.
There's a ton of
lots of lots of different programming languages out there, definitely. But shifting maybe to a different sort of category of questions in terms of your research, just wondering what sort of so considering your worked in the area of epidemiology and road safety and public health, I was just wondering what the role of statistical research was in policy design, and especially in what the process is from writing a paper and then to sort of advising on policy.
At the start of one of the most difficult things about trying to do research that is meant to, let's just say, evaluate policy. Like the policies may have already come in and exist, and we want to evaluate what things are a good idea. There are times when we want to be able to, a policy doesn't exist, but you want to do research to get a sense about whether policy should exist. You really have to start off with data, I suppose. Look, if a policy has already been implemented, you're not going to be able to collect your own data that existed before the policy. You need to have some sense about what happened prior to the policy being around, right? And if you weren't part of, or somebody had started a study prior to that, there is no pre-policy data. let's say pre-legislation data. So you have to exist on routinely collected data. Now, depending on where you are in the world, Australia does a fairly good job with medical stuff. So hospital records around the country are all electronic, which is fantastic. Death data is available electronically. That's also fantastic. The ABS collects population information all the time, so we know how many Australians there are at various places and around in different states and LGAs and other different divisions of geographic divisions. But if that stuff doesn't exist, then you really can't get a good sense about what's going on. So you have to start with good sources of data, and that, as I'd say, that's why we need the ABS. We need other bodies in the government to routinely collect important data. One of the things, so in road safety, one of the things that I think we do an awfully poor job of in Australia is to collect mobility data, as in how do people get around? How often do they use things? Do you walk to work or walk to the grocery store or the shops or whatever? Do you ride a bike or do you drive? Or how often? And that needs to be separated out into different, possibly genders and sexes, and also different age groups and different locations and other things like that. So we know that this is how people are getting around. It's important because it impels the politicians to spend money to make those to support those modes of transport. Okay, so like if tons of people are riding bikes all the time, say, well, why the hell are we building roads for cars, for example? But without that information, we don't fully have an idea about it. Now, there's bits of information that may exist at various times, like the city of Sydney might do some survey and collect some information, and the Melbourne, what's it called? It's like the inner city of Melbourne has I can't remember this. It's either City of Melbourne or something like that. They also do a bit of that, but there's no like Australia-wide data that does that. Not many countries do apparently, but some countries collect mobility data kind of regularly. And so you have to start off by having data to be able to do stuff. And honestly, in epi, from a let's just say from an injury or road safety kind of perspective, is often not data there, or or the data that is there is not quite ideal. Now, sometimes the data is so bad, it's like you really just need to ignore it. Like it's too bad, we can't actually answer questions from this. We just need to push it aside. Not everyone is willing to do that, unfortunately, but sometimes the data the data that is available just isn't up to being answer whatever research question you have in a reasonable way. Just because you've got numbers doesn't mean you have valid information.
Right, yeah. I was wondering, leading up from that, what are some limitations that you've encountered from using statistical methods in your research?
I mean, in epidemiology, we often deal with, or you pretty much always deal with observational data. So there is no randomized control trial kind of data. We don't have a random sample of the population. And so having observational data automatically comes with certain kinds of weaknesses because of that. Confounding is a very difficult thing to understand conceptually, but that can explain why we may observe something to be either, let's just say, kind of successful or a failure, but it's because there is some confounding that happened. And the confounding often happens because we don't randomly choose to treat people in observational studies. Even though for example, we have seatbelt laws here and lots of other places, but when you get in a motor vehicle, no one is prompting you to put it on, right? So there are compliance issues there where people will voluntarily choose not to do something or choose to do something. We don't have the ability to control that in epidemiological research. But having said that, we can't also go to everyone's house or whatever and make them put a seatbelt on when they get in the car. Like we can't make people or not make people to smoke cigarettes or use tobacco or to use alcohol or other things like that. People will voluntarily do something silly like drink a lot and then get in a motor vehicle and drive. Right? It's illegal, but there's no one going to automatically stop someone from doing it, right?
That's
so,
yeah.
So observational data is always problematic for that reason. There's also other kind of less advertised things like what's called regression to the mean. And that if you have say before and after studies, that things can get better. So what happens sometimes in road safety and other policy kind of areas is that policies may come in because things get really bad. So like there's maybe a lot of crashes, like injuries or serious injuries, even fatalities. So if you think about a time series, like things spike up and then the government says, oh, we need to do something about that. And they do something about it and things go down. Now they could go down because some new intervention was effective, but it could have just been that time when things looked really, really bad, that was just in the far tail of some distribution. They say the regular distribution that is being observed has been observed for a long time now. That it's just sometimes we observe stuff in the tails of distributions. And when we do that, things will just automatically go back to normal. That's where the idea of regression to the mean comes from. Is that so things that are normal, I don't mean normal like the normal distribution, but let's just say typical maybe, that may seem atypical is really just part of some typical process, but things go back to normal and it looks like there was this big change. But it's not because there really is any change, but it's from what's called regression.
Another thing about your research that we would like to know, I guess, is whether there's any surprising or unexpected results that you've discovered.
So one of the things I've done in the past few years is got interested in what speed limits should be for motor vehicles traveling near. Sorry, I'm getting this note there. Is that what should speed limits be around pedestrian areas? So like it's clear that it shouldn't be say 80 kilometers an hour or 100 kilometers an hour if there are pedestrians around, but there is this fairly big debate worldwide as to what speed limit should be. So the default speed limit in Australia tends to be 50 kilometers an hour. So if there's nothing posted anywhere, it's 50 kilometers an hour. Now, in the city of Sydney, they've adopted 40 kilometers hour zones, although where the lines are marked off isn't always 100% clear, but there is this idea that in those areas where there may be a lot of pedestrians, it should be a bit lower than 50. But there's still this question about what should it be? Should it be 30? A lot of European countries and cities in Europe have 30 kilometers an hour. So I got interested in that and did a systematic review and meta-analysis where we collected studies that looked into pedestrians being hit by the front of a motor vehicle and whether they died or not. Now, some studies have serious injuries or not, so the person didn't die, but primarily we're trying to base this on fatalities. And it turns out that if you are hit by a motor vehicle at 30 kilometers an hour, our best guess is that you have about a 5% chance of dying. No probability larger than 0% is an acceptable risk, but the only way to get to 0% for the probability or 0 for the probability is to have no motor vehicles, which some people would argue we should be doing, and they're not necessarily wrong about that. But if we have motor vehicles and they are allowed to be sort of near where pedestrians are, the speed at impact should be no more than 30 kilometers an hour. Now, you could then kind of deduce that, well, if the impact speed is 30 and means maybe we could set speed limits to 40, assuming that if there was about to be a crash, the car could slow down to at least 30 or less. Now, when getting into serious injuries, you would think that the probabilities of these things happening would be, the probability of fatality would usually be less than the probability of a serious injury. Okay, but given the data we have, it's actually the other way around. Now, I know why that's happening. It's not that you're less likely to, so if you're hit by a vehicle, you think dying would be have a lower probability than having an injury, just a survivable injury. Okay. The issue is that when the data is being collected, auditors have to go to a scene and use various measuring ways. Like they measure like the length of skid marks that the tires made, and they measure how far the body was thrown when hit by body and things like that. They use that to get an estimate of impact speed. Okay. Now, if a car bumps into a pedestrian, maybe knocks them over, but they get up and they walk away, those never get audited. And so the ones that are not very serious don't exist in any data set. The ones that are low speed and don't exist. So there's this problem of what I might call sampling. There's very little information at the lower speeds for injuries. And so only the really serious ones are being captured in various databases that could then be analyzed. Because we often don't we really don't ever collect information on things that are minor. And if we don't know what's happening with minor injuries, we don't really have a comparison to be able to accurately estimate what are called risk curves, which is the probability of having some event given an impact speed, say. But we don't really have an idea about that unless we have, we collect more data. If that makes sense. It's not that you're less likely to die as opposed to have a serious injury. It's actually quite likely to. I mean, I'm 100% positive it's the other way around, but it's because of data collection, not because of anything. But trying to get governments and politicians to collect that data is a struggle. I've got a colleague I guess he was at the World Bank, and they do a fair bit of road safety stuff. And I think it took me a long time to convince them that's what was happening, but they're not going to invest any money into collecting better data.
Cool. Just as a closing question then, do you have any general advice for students studying math, statistics, data science, and any other fields that you're interested or involved with?
That's a good question. I mean, data science didn't exist when I was a student. I mean, the various aspects of it did, right? Like we can think about data science or analytics as being this combination of various disciplines kind of coming together, right? If I were starting out, I think I would tell myself maybe I'd say mathematics is important. Statistics is important. You need to have a good, solid understanding of all those things, but also understanding how data are generated, not just I'm going to fit like these very complicated neural networks or other kinds of really complicated. None of that really matters unless you get a really good sense about the content area itself. And so I think I kind of got at before, was that just because you have a bunch of numbers doesn't mean you have information that's relevant to what you're trying to do. I think one of the things that's helped me in my career, look, at a minimum, I had to have a good understanding of mathematics and statistics to do what I do. That is, I think that's obvious though. The things that really helped me is getting a good understanding of content area and spending a lot of time doing so. I had professors when I was a student tell me, "Oh, you don't really need to understand biology to do biostatistics." Like, I feel like I really should have done some minor in biology a long time ago to have a better understanding. So I think I would be a better statistician, data scientist, data analytics person had I had that information. I'm not, and like I had to learn epidemiology as part of my job, and I'm glad I did. I wish I'd have had that as a student. I mean, it's something I was able to pick up, thankfully, but I had to have a good understanding of things like that. The content areas I was working in, which a lot of it is how are data generated, how are hospital information coded, for example. Like the WHO publishes what are called international classifications of diseases. So if you've ever been hospitalized in Australia, pretty much anywhere in the world, whatever you had is a code, probably multiple codes, right? And having understanding of how all those things, what those things are, and how we can use databases to identify, well, these are all the patients who had multiple myeloma, for example, which is a kind of cancer. Or we identify all the people who've been in a car crash who had a skull fracture, things like that. So having understanding of all these various things is really important. I think maybe as a general kind of ethos, I'd say that I feel like you have to be kind of an expert in lots and lots of different things. It's not really a jack of all trades. I think if you're just a jack of all trades, you don't have enough substantive information about any one area, and you kind of get lost in the mix. I think you kind of have to have expertise in lots of different things to be a good data analyst, statistician, data scientist. And I'd also say you're gonna have a life of always learning new things, because everything is always changing. Right. Like I remember back when I was a student, like backwards elimination was like, oh, that would be kind of an interesting thing to do to select some model. And then some people would say a few years after that, oh, that's a terrible idea because you don't want the data to tell you what the model should be. And then over time, like it seems like it pops up again, and someone says, oh, well, it's a good reason to do this for this reason. And some people say it's a terrible thing. There's this ongoing debate about that, and I'm having a discussion with a colleague over email, is about whether we should be reporting what are called odds ratios or we should be reporting relative risks. They're both computed from effectively the same data, but some people say, well, relative risk is a measure that's considered collapsible, and this is a great property to have. And then some people will say, well, I don't care about collapsibility, it should be what's called portable. And so you get in all these broad discussions, and you think, well, these are things that have been settled. These are debates that we should have had 20 years ago, and we should have settled on an answer. It turns out, in reality, we often don't have 100% answers to everything, right? And so it's really good to have an understanding what all these various things are. So when you're out on your own and you don't have someone you can just, hey, can you tell me what the answers are? You have a sense about what the arguments are, and you can make good decisions for yourself.
All right, thank you so much for that then, Jake. That just about wraps it up for the interview. It was really nice to hear about your experience and research interests. So thank you very much for your time.
Not a problem, Gordon.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, not a problem, Julian.